Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our own very special series on global politics on the KJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US-based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here as always.
Wonderful. Welcome once again. So, several big topics again. Irina, we do it every 2 weeks, this particular show. And let's start with India itself. And from India, where the Dalai Lama is, he has said that he will have a successor after his death. I am affirming that the institution of Dalai Lama will continue. That's one part of his statement. So I want to understand, how do you see that? India has been talking about seeking permanent solution to border dispute with China. China has a very different view of Dalai Lama and the way they see things. And now here, this particular China, so I want to understand, how is it going to impact India-China relations? How do you see this development?
Well, first of all, the Dalai Lama is 90 years old, so this question is not theoretical or something that's decades away. This is something that may be resolved within, a decade or so, or less, or maybe a few years more than that. But eventually, in our lifetimes, it will come to a head if things continue as they are. Just to explain the background, the Chinese Communist Party has a very adversarial relationship with the Dalai Lama and the concept of his reincarnation. The CCP asserts its authority in determining the next Dalai Lama, while the Dalai Lama maintains that his reincarnation will be determined by the Garden Fordering Trust and not by the CCP, which highlights a very fundamental conflict over religious authority and Tibetan autonomy. Now, all of this I find extremely strange because CCP is basically atheist. It does recognize several major religions within China, but even those religions that are technically recognized are subject to restrictions, persecution, and control by the Chinese Communist Party. That includes Christian churches. It includes discriminatory practices against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, and of course the persecution of Tibetan Buddhists. This extremely strange concept that a communist party would be in charge of somebody's reincarnation, a concept that is religious and has nothing to do with the political economy or governance or politics in China, it seems to me absurd on its face, but it's also clearly just an excuse to try to control populations, to de-recognize ethnic and religious diversity, and to essentially control the Chinese population through nationalism just as much as also religious or a religious conformity, rather. Essentially, the CCP does not recognize the Dalai Lama's authority to determine his successor. They say that the process must comply with Chinese laws and regulations. And the history of this is that following the 1950 invasion of Tibet, the CCP has sought to control Tibetan Buddhism and all of its institutions. They see the Dalai Lama not just as a religious leader, but as a political figure who could potentially incite separatism. And essentially, the CCP wants to see a quote-unquote loyal Dalai Lama to follow. This one, it would be somebody who aligns with the political interests of the Communist Party. Such a person would potentially undermine the Tibetan government in exile, as well as the broader Tibetan independence movements. And there's a history of CCP actually interfering in the selection of these lamas, including the Panchen Lama, where they installed their own candidate after detaining the one chosen by the Dalai Lama. So the response with this renewed insistence on appointing the successor is driven by desire to exert control over Tibet and prevent any potential challenge to the CCP's rule in Tibet. Now, there's not a huge risk of that, to be honest, because the government in exile does not have political or military power, and most of the Chinese population is Han Chinese and they don't particularly care about this issue. Certainly, they're not sympathetic enough to aid any independence movements. But um, the CCP has been extremely concerned about exercising its authority, and this issue could ignite tensions even with India, which hosts the Dalai Lama.
Absolutely. So that's where the issue is, Irina, is that how is it going to impact India-China relations? Because this is going to create more news, and China will continue. And India is talking about, just is looking at seeking permanent solution to border dispute with China. How does it all look to be panning out in the days to come, Irina?
Quite frankly, I can see China trying to use this issue as leverage, essentially, perhaps conditioning the final settlement of the border dispute on India's facilitation of the CCP's agenda regarding the Dalai Lama. For instance, they could request or demand the expulsion of the government in exile and the Dalai Lama, or they could insist that India should condition its continuing hosting of the government in exile on cooperation with the CCP in appointing the next successor. I think these are possible moves by the CCP, and much depends on how badly India wants that dispute and whether they feel resolved and whether they feel like whether it's worth their while to continue resisting the CCP on this issue, or whether pragmatic considerations over a quick resolution could prevail. Now, let me add that so far there hasn't been a clear ultimatum of that sort or clear quid pro quo, and India would be right not to trust CCP's promises, even if such an agreement became a real possibility, because CCP views its interests as global, and in that sense cannot be trusted not to continue interfering or causing border issues in the future once they got what they wanted, and after they also undermined India's credibility with Buddhist populations and Chinese opposition movements.
Absolutely. What about the Western world? Will we? It has its own view on China, and do you think this will give them one more issue to raise some more noise and voice and dust about China and looking at leveraging this for their own benefits with China? How do you look at it?
Well, it's certainly the case that some human rights movements have kept the Tibetan issue as part of its pressure campaign against China in the West. But unfortunately, unlike some of the alleged liberation movements and popular protests, it has not gained that much attention, and certainly not in recent years. There was a brief period about, a couple decades ago when there were student protests on campuses in support of Tibet independence. China cracked down even further. They have been wholesale destroying Tibetan culture and religious um, infrastructure to erase history and to shape a conformist version of the Chinese population. But all of that is all of that has fizzled out in terms of Western interest. It's that this movement, this support for Tibetan independence, is not at the forefront of any serious political measures. Maybe some censures of China, or congressional resolutions in the U.S., but there isn't a mass movement in support of Tibetan independence. Just like There isn't a mass movement in support of Hong Kong, and for that matter, even Taiwan, which has been far more a consistent issue and subject to major financial investments into its military from the U.S. Still to this day, the U.S. does not recognize Taiwan's independence. So I'm not particularly shocked that there is such a short attention span, and why there's the same types of voices who allow China, who who make excuses for China to meddle in U.S. Chinese diaspora communities, absolutely are overly cautious in being seen as meddling in quote unquote Chinese affairs. So there is a huge level of double standards in that regard, and over caution, I would say, by Western powers to um, abstain from leveraging this issue against China. I would certainly recommend it. I would think it's also the right thing to do, but we are seeing this sort of over cautious, even somewhat craven approach to realpolitik and geopolitics, which focuses more on trade or very passive resolution of issues with China rather than a much more aggressive approach that could mirror to some extent China's own strategy.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. Now, staying with India itself, let's talk about the S-400 system from Russia. This talk of going, purchasing two more of these, and with lots of people saying that it has its own weaknesses. How do you see this part? Means from every aspect, political as well as economic aspect.
Well, from a political and military perspective, it's after the situation, recent confrontation with Pakistan, it became obvious that India needs to upgrade its air defenses. That's not even a question. I don't think anyone would seriously argue that that's not the case. Pakistan has managed, allegedly, and that seemed to have been confirmed by some sources, to down five Indian jets and caused other types of damage with drones. So an defense upgrade is in order. The other question is affordability. The S-400 certainly has not met its expectations. It was boasted by Russia for a long time, but eventually has not proven itself, whether in battle. We have seen what happened in Ukraine and other places. So it's obviously not comparable to THAAD or Patriot by the US or other competitive Western systems, but it is much more affordable, and it is also faster, more regularly available. Thought can take years to produce, and if there is a clear expectation of a potential additional escalation with Pakistan, surely there needs to be an available defense system fairly quickly. Those, I think, the considerations driving the India government's decision to make these purchases rather than some anti-Western animus or some political calculus. I think the considerations in this case are purely pragmatic and based on affordability and availability. If the West
Absolutely.
can somehow make discount systems, if they're serious about countering Russia's weapons, or can arrange some sort of a practical payment plan, or can expedite the production of these systems and prioritize India's needs, I think maybe we'd be looking at a different scenario, but that it does not seem to have happened, at least not yet.
Absolutely, and maybe one of the big reasons is that the legacy, the past history with Russia. At least Russia has been a partner which could be trusted in that sense. People get that thing, and others, everywhere else. I think that's why Indian government seems to be looking at that pragmatic part too.
I mean, first of all, yeah, Russia would deliver the systems fairly quickly. India is one of the major clients. It already has interoperability with other military systems, which significantly facilitates quick application, and uh, its use is already well established in India. There's another concern, which is that U.S. in the past has sometimes reneged on its contractual commitments to countries, and I think that's also a rising concern. And I think India is looking to secure something rather than commit to an American system only to have it pulled for whatever reason, thanks to lobbying efforts or U.S. inability to deliver on time or something like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And talking of US, India, the trade deal seems to be, facing its own challenges. What is your view on this? How do you look at it? Does it look to be coming, or is it, it will take some time? US is looking at differently, India is looking at it differently.
The biggest obstacle at this moment, over the time of our discussion, is the dairy and agriculture aspects of the deal. India and US both renewed an attempt to push through some sort of a consensus after US just concluded a trade deal with Vietnam that would lower tariffs for Vietnamese to purchase goods there, but actually it retains tariffs in place in the United States, meaning American consumers and companies would still pay a lot more for purchasing Vietnam made goods. Now, this is not a condition that would be favorable to India's interest as it seeks to increase its exports to the United States. Uh, at the same time, its imports from the US would be largely technological and not necessarily comparable in value and quantity to the sort of products India exports. So, for that reason, the dairy products and the agricultural products remain a point of contention. This is where that conflict remains. It's unclear how it's going to get resolved. Obviously, something is going to have to give. I also don't understand why the this deal is being viewed as a zero-sum game. Either you agree on all points or you don't agree at all, as opposed to making at least partial agreements on some aspects of the tariffs and trade agreements and separately negotiating others, because at the very least both sides will be served by coming to an agreement on at least a partial basis. Why there needs to be this mega deal all at the same time, especially when Trump announced a potential deadline for the imposition of the full tariffs, also remains unclear. And of course, there's the legal concerns, because Trump is not supposed to be implementing all these across the board tariffs without congressional involvement. Congress has de facto reneged its power and essentially transferred it over to the executive branch. Even if Trump were to bring the matter to a vote, it would most likely be rubber stamped under the current congressional composition, but still, it remains a very highly questionable process, which has already been ruled to be illegal in the way it's being implemented by multiple federal courts. All of these issues create very problematic context for this diplomatic effort. I think both it would be wiser to focus on at least gaining some smaller agreements and then working out these points of contention separately. But I obviously am not in the room and I'm not privy to the full scale of the deliberations, or why both sides seem to be so intent on some huge deal. Maybe it's for PR, maybe it's because of the nature of the way these deals are being structured. It's not very clear.
Absolutely, absolutely. From India, US to, let's go straightway to the US itself, and that is where New York Democrats nominated Democratic Socialist Zohran Mamdani. He seems to be making a lot of news, and he about all this, globalizing the intifada, and what about all these things is coming on. And then I also read about that he clarifying that he will be looking at everything, including other religious sections, as he should be as a public figure. Why is this whole controversy happening? Why is he so making so much even before the official election and all? And they were globalizing all these things. Where is it going to lead to his nomination?
Well, unfortunately, he seems to be the leading candidate at the moment. The independent votes are being split thanks to Cuomo's rejection to withdraw from the process, which would have allowed Eric Adams, the current mayor, to run as an independent and potentially uh, move some of the votes for Mamdani out away from him. There's no serious Republican candidate against Mamdani. Curtis Sliwa, however, could give some portion of the votes if the votes between in a race of two would be close enough. Unfortunately, these political spoilers seem to be looking to gain attention rather than seriously deny the election to somebody with a great potential to cause massive damage. Now, Mamdani appears to be the product of extremely ideological parents, very left wing, very dedicated to revolutionary political and economic causes. He seems to be a reflection of these values. He seems to be courting particular segments of the population. He seems to be incredibly uncomfortable with unequivocally denouncing globalizing the Intifada language. It seems to be that as a politician, he's trying to avoid being pigeonholed as someone who's against that sort of terminology. And it's clear that he is capable of gaining majority of politically active Democrats without ethnic and racial minorities who were against all of these things, because they know that defunding the police, supporting radical economic or political policies is never good for minority and poor neighborhoods. Most people who supported Mamdani are white, educated, middle class, and upper class individuals, many of whom are likely to move away if the policy seriously hurt their interests. Many of them are academics, they're not affected by business, taxes, and things of that nature. That said, I think Mamdani is also being quite opportunistic. He also indicated that he would be willing not to tax or to show favor to the businesses that essentially provided his campaign or his interests with reciprocal favors and preferential status. So it looks like he is looking to capitalize financially on his own arrangement. And as much as some of it could be pure ideology in action, a lot of it is just a protection racket of the sort we have seen in New York in the Democratic Party for well over a century, with nothing changing except the language and the names of the parties or the movements supporting these people. Typical Tammany Hall politics. I'm sorry to say it's quite a fraud in many respects, and it's a shame that more people are not seeing right through it. Mamdani is not giving up his own private property. He is using exceedingly discriminatory language focused on the rich and the white, which, taxing white people of any basically ethnic or racial background at a different rate than others is unconstitutional, as opposed to simply, imposing particular types of economic programs. And he knows, I'm sure he's well aware that it's something like that would lead to extensive litigation and probably would be banned in courts, but he's trying to gain favors of particularly radical segments of New York demographics, and he doesn't care if he alienates a lot of moderate votes. And so far, things are moving in his favor again with the split vote among other candidates. despite the fact that a lot of people voted for him as a protest vote against Cuomo, who is himself highly problematic for different reasons. Mm, Here he has an opportunity to pull off a Donald Trump and by essentially getting rid of his opponents, clear his own path, even if his policies themselves are not nearly as popular as he makes them out to be.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, is his election a foregone conclusion, or is there anything that can still go wrong for him?
Look, Cuomo could still drop out. Something could happen with Mamdani. People could wake up to the reality of the long-term consequences of his vision, or the fact that he simply cannot be trusted with his word. He could be playing off different groups against one another entirely for personal gain and cronyism. And I think maybe people could realize and wake up to its facts and so forth. But unless a much stronger candidate emerges out of the blue from somewhere, I see that he is currently heavily favored by the factors. The fact that Eric Adams is unpopular, has been accused of corruption, is associated with Donald Trump's uh, pardoning him in exchange for political favors and cooperation with ICE inside New York. That um, Cuomo is seen as hopelessly corrupt and a sex offender, essentially, sexual harasser. All of these things are helping Mamdani without him having to do anything positive to earn it.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. Let's move on from that to Operation Rising Line aftermath. What's happening is there between Israel, Iran, and the US? Because Iran says it will go ahead with its plans, and that it said it was hurt with American attack, but many people say that nothing happened because in those mountains as much as it should be. So everything seems to mean, where is Israel in all these things? Is that can we look at peace now that everyone has got the chance to fire their missiles and whatever they had? How does it look like? Is Iran in a position to get back to its old state of making what it wants to make?
Well, as far as the Fordo and some of the other sites are concerned, according to Israeli and some of the US intelligence assessments, the damage to the infrastructure there likely was quite substantial. The Israelis are optimistic in believing that Iran's nuclear program could have been set back as far as 2 years. Others are more conservative in their estimations, and they're saying it's 6 to 18 months in terms of being set back, but some damage was clearly done. There are concerns that some of the uranium was smuggled out of the facilities before the bombing, thanks to Trump's warning, and nobody is quite sure where they ultimately went. For whatever reason, Israelis are not in a position to take care of that matter once and for all. US is threatening Iran with assorted measures if they go ahead and move forward with the program regardless. Not sure that Iran cares about those types of consequences. I'm also find it suspicious that it has been relatively calm in handling a complete intelligence disaster, which leads me to believe that while some of the officials may have been concerned about their own safety as a result of strikes, the nuclear program and some of Iran's arsenals may have had a layer of protection well in advance of these operations or their announcement. They've had time to do that. First of all, it makes sense that Israel, which has threatened to interfere with Iran's nuclear production for many years and in the past has already assassinated nuclear scientists, would do so again at some point. And it would make sense to diversify the portfolio of places where the program would reside. Second, even President Biden, shortly before leaving office, discussed potential strikes on those sites. So at that point, I think it came close enough that I think Iran would have taken measures long before Trump even contemplated this inherent session. Third is the fact that Trump gave advance warning 60 days. He gave Iran 60 days. Obviously, many people were skeptical that he would move forward with anything, but he also gave additional warnings shortly before the attacks, and there were movements in the area that indicated that at the very least the preparations were at the ready, depending on the last minute decision. All of that gave Iran plenty of time and opportunity to prepare. And personally, I think they have parts of the program that are well outside the reach of US or Israeli bombardments, that they may be outside the country entirely, that Iran may have appropriate arrangements with allies like North Korea, possibly Pakistan or South Africa and Algeria, um, which are heavily dependent on financial assistance, have cooperated with Iran on various issues in the past and continue to do so now, and are generally anti Western in their political outlook. All of these things indicate that there may be more to the story that the intelligence reports are not publicly admitting, and that measuring the readiness of the nuclear program based on the estimations of the damages to the nuclear sites alone is not sufficient at the very least, even if those assessments are accurate, but based on the Iran Israeli Mossad agents who were allegedly on the ground um measuring the impact. That's so basically those measurements are all based on the assumption that that's all Iran has got, and that's the brunt of the nuclear program. If, on the other hand, we assume that Iran took other measures, then that damage could be at least partially irrelevant.
Absolutely. So, who is the biggest winner of this Operation Rising Line? Means, have Israel won? Is the US won because it was talking about peace? Has Iran won because it got exposed here, its defense system and everything? How do you look at from? Everyone seems to have got, people will have their own views about this.
Look, in the short term, obviously, US and Israel appears to have restored deterrence and made Iran look very weak in the region, and they may have caused sufficient damage to, cause Iran to have to slow down and to reassess the way it's going. However, the regime is highly ideological, so simple degradation of its capabilities alone won't be enough to stop it. Furthermore, Iran won from seeing US exercising a lot of pressure over Israel to withdraw from Gaza, not to move forward with attacks on energy sites, to curtail and not to fully degrade the nuclear program, and not to assassinate the leadership, which would have forced the regime to scramble and to weaken it to the same level that Hezbollah was weakened at its time. All of these things show that in the long term, Iran may have won breathing room at the very least, and a new lifeline to survival, despite the fact that Israel and the US were in a position to cause it much more serious damage.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's move on from this part of conflict to another, that is the Ukraine there. And there, US is looking to cancel democracy programs and funding for investigation of war crimes in Ukraine. What does it mean, and why is the US acting this way right now?
Now, official reasons are basically savings. We now know from our experience with Doge that those savings are not only microscopic at best, but they are more than likely to be cancelled out by the costs of all these reassessments, by overall government spending, which has been increasing by the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, and by the opportunity cost of strengthening Russia's hands in the region and contributing to further regional destabilization. None of these things are excusable. All of them can be explained by the strange sympathy in the Pentagon and in the White House towards Russia. And we have seen that there's been a number of people in the Pentagon in particular who have been particularly isolationist, particularly ideologically open to working with Russia, and particularly anti-Ukraine in a way that's not rational or in line with measurable practical U.S. interests. Um, Unfortunately, there seems to be a concentration of such decision makers. Elbridge Colby seems to be the driving mind behind this particular initiative, and it seems to be spite and ideology rather than any serious practical decision, especially the concept of investigating war crimes. It's really minimal in terms of cost, and it would position the US as having credibility on the international stage, to um, promote the rule of law in general. People like Colby who are backing away from it clearly seem to believe in the um, um, might means right um, view of foreign policy which predominated during the colonialist era. I don't think that will serve US well at all. I think US is not that great at it. Other countries are much better, and instead of sticking to what we do best, we will try to imitate aggressors and only strengthen them as a result.
Absolutely, absolutely. And recently there was this huge attack from Russian side on the the largest, as they say, on Ukraine, and in that aspect, if we look at it, it was almost like it was fighting alone at that point in time. That brings me to the NATO summit. How should we look at the relevance of NATO now? What did we achieve in this summit? What are they doing for Ukraine here? Because it lost one plane or one pilot, and so many other damages were done. I want to understand: are these bodies slightly getting diluted and going into oblivion? How does it look like, or will NATO survive just the way it is without it being much effective?
Well, on the surface, everyone talked about the NATO summit being positive because its Secretary General Mark Rutte basically flattered Trump and got him to be more positive. Reality is, if once we get past the optics, it did not go well. Trump left early. He indicated that he didn't want to stay there all this time. He made other excuses, but it was very clear that he does not take NATO to be a serious institution. The biggest positive takeaway is that attempt to commit to the 5% increased defense spending. That said, I'm not sure that's sufficient. Some countries continue to resist, like Spain, who are far away from their action and who, for political reasons, have essentially sold out. There is another aspect to it, which is simply increasing the spending doesn't mean that it will be spent efficiently, adequately, or implemented in a way that's consistent with the needs. It seems to be a virtue signaling way, and a way for US to push its own weapons to be bought up, regardless of whether they are actually used or not on anything in particular. So I'm not. There were no serious commitments other than that towards Ukraine. Yes, individually, a lot of the countries are already supplying with Ukraine with a lot of advanced weapons and will increase or continue to do so. But as an organization, NATO has not yet come up with a way of dealing with the situation without the US playing a significant role. And Trump, for his own part, did not make any clear commitments to anything. So, despite all the flattery and Trump's positive rhetoric, he has not, in fact, committed to anything that hasn't already been quietly done. In fact, there is also a complete lack of clarity on the continuity of some of the NATO bases and programs in various parts of Europe, and whether or not Trump will ultimately allow them to continue, or whether he will shrink the U.S. presence in Europe, there is no clear communication, and no one seems to have any clear indication of which way that policy is going to go. So, in that sense, I don't think the summit was successful at all.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that brings me to the last topic of the day is that U.S.-Japan relations. Why is it having its own challenges? And U.S. also knows that to deal with China, it needs Japan. Help us understand what's happening between U.S. and Japan.
Well, there's several different things. One is the trade deal, which is exceptionally strange, nebulous, evolving, and US is not committing to any clear terms, and Japan is rejecting committing to things that are poorly understood and unlikely to benefit it in any substantial way. So the trade deal is a major part of the reason. There's also tensions over defense. The fact that some members of Trump's cabinet have been essentially treating Japan as an enemy, or obsessing over the history rather than focusing on the current leadership, current needs, and current common interests and values. There seems to be a concern about whether Trump is taking Japan seriously, and essentially there's been outrage over Trump comparing Iran strikes to Japan atomic bombing for reasons that are fairly why there's outrage. I think it's fairly obvious. So Trump doesn't seem to have a good stronghold of history, nor does he particularly care. Nevertheless, despite whatever his motivations, the impact is highly negative and essentially only helps isolationists and adversarial countries. Trump is threatening Japan with the 35% tariff, which could lead to a major trade war. And let's remember that the trade war with China has not been fully resolved either. So instead of working to bring US and Japan closer against China, Trump seems to be dividing US from everybody else with the way he treats his allies.
Absolutely, absolutely. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.